On a Tuesday morning in May of 1983, a woman named Rose Calloway stood in a farmyard in Russell County, Kansas, and raised her hand. She was 40 years old. Her jacket was faded at the elbows, the same one she had worn to her father's funeral 20 years before. Her hands were calloused and stained in the way that does not wash out the kind of stain that becomes part of the skin after enough seasons. The auctioneer called the number. The hammer came down. And just like that, Rose Calloway paid $68,000 in cash for 160 acres of Kansas bottomland that a man named Howard Tatum had bought in 1976 for nearly twice that amount. The crowd murmured. People turned to look at her the way people turn to look at something they did not expect to see. A few of them knew her name. Most of them did not. But there was one man standing at the far edge of that yard near the back fence, hat pulled low over his face, who knew exactly who she was. He had known her since she was 20 years old and walked through the glass door of his dealership asking for help. His name was Frank Denton, and 20 years earlier he had laughed at her. Let me take you back to where this story actually started, not the auction, the laugh. In the winter of 1963, Earl Calloway was 58 years old. He had farmed 240 acres west of Russell for most of his adult life, working ground that did not give itself easily to anyone. He was not a large man, and he was not a loud one. He was the kind of man people remembered when they needed something done without complaint, when they needed someone who would show up in the dark and stay until the work was finished. Earl had raised Rose alone since she was 7 years old when her mother June died from a fever that came fast and did not leave. He did not raise her soft. By the time she was 12, she could drive a tractor in a straight line across a long field without drifting. By 14, she could read a hydraulic manual and understand what it was asking of her. By the time she was grown, she understood soil the way some people understand weather, not from textbooks, but from watching, from paying attention to what the ground showed you when you were willing to get close enough to look. The stroke took Earl in January. It came fast, the doctor said. They always say that, as if fast makes it easier, as if speed is a kindness when the thing moving fast is loss. The funeral was small, 30 people in folding chairs at the church on Maple Street. Pastor Whitmore spoke about hard work and faith and the land that outlasts us. Rose sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes dry. She did not cry there, not where people could see it and decide what it meant about her. What her father left behind was not money, it was land. 240 acres of Kansas soil that had taken a lifetime to understand. A house with a roof that leaked in 2 places, and a porch step that had been broken since October. A 1955 John Deere 60, sitting in the equipment shed, with a seized engine that had not turned over in 2 years, and a bank account at Russell First National that held $847. The day after the funeral, Rose sat at the kitchen table with the farm ledger open in front of her. The numbers did not require interpretation. $847 minus $215 for funeral expenses left $632. Minus $340 in back property taxes left $292. That was what stood between her and losing everything her father had spent his life building. She needed a tractor, she needed seed, she needed fuel and parts and time she did not have. She was 20 years old and she was alone, and the spring planting season would not wait for her to figure out what came next. The bank was her first attempt. She drove to Russell First National on a Thursday morning, sat across from the loan officer, a polite and carefully dressed man named Gerald Sims, and explained what she needed. Gerald Sims listened with the expression of a man who has already decided something but is allowing the other person to finish speaking out of courtesy. He told her the bank could not extend credit to a 20-year-old woman with no collateral beyond land that was barely paid off and equipment that did not run. He said it the way people say things when they have said the same thing many times and no longer hear themselves saying it. He suggested she come back with a co-signer. Preferably, he said, a husband. Rose thanked him and drove home. That evening she sat on the broken porch step and looked out at the fields. The ground was still frozen. The sky was low and gray and indifferent. She could walk away from all of it, get a job at the diner on Main Street, rent the small apartment above the hardware store on Second Avenue, let the land go to auction and let someone else deal with the weight of it. That was the easy version of the story, the safe one, the one that did not ask very much of her. She went back inside and did not sleep well. 3 days after the bank turned her down, Rose drove 40 miles east to the John Deere dealership in Hayes. Morrison's was the largest operation in the region, the kind of place that smelled of fresh paint and leather seat covers, and the particular kind of optimism that belongs to people who sell things for a living. Frank Denton ran the business. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, with clean hands and the easy confidence of a man who has spent 3 decades in a room where he controls most of what happens. Rose walked through the glass door on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The bell above the frame had not finished its chime before Frank Denton looked up from his paperwork and made his assessment. It did not take long. His eyes moved across her once quick and complete the way a man looks at something he has already categorized. The jacket too large for her frame, the sleeves rolled twice the fabric worn through at one elbow. The boots that had seen real work. The way she held herself careful and steady, as if she had learned early that the room would not automatically make space for her. The laugh came before the words. Not a polite sound, not the kind you swallow when you realize you have made a mistake. This was the other kind, loud enough to carry, loud enough that 2 farmers near the display tractors glanced over, loud enough that a young salesman at the far counter looked up to see what had been found amusing. Frank Denton set his pen down on the desk and leaned back in his chair with the comfortable ease of a man who has all the time in the world. He asked if he could help her, and the way he asked it made the question into something else entirely. Rose told him she needed a tractor, something that could work 240 acres. Frank Denton nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they are not actually agreeing with anything but are preparing to explain something they believe should be obvious. He said he had heard about Earl, said Earl had been a good customer, said he was sorry for her loss. Then he studied her the way you study a problem you have already solved. He talked about her options, leasing the ground to Roy Fenner, who was looking to expand and would pay a fair price, selling the land outright, taking the money, getting a place in town. He said she was a pretty girl, and he said it without hesitation, as if it were a relevant fact in a business conversation. He said she would find a husband, said a man could handle the hard parts. She heard every word. She understood what was underneath them. It was not cruelty exactly, it was something that in some ways goes deeper than cruelty. It was the absolute certainty that her story had already been written by someone else, and that the most useful thing she could do was accept the ending that had been prepared for her. Rose did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She asked Frank Denton one question. She asked if he had a used tractor for sale. He did. A 1958 John Deere 730, $12,000, 10% down, 7 years, 9% interest. He quoted the terms the way a man quotes terms when he does not actually expect them to be met, when the quoting itself is meant to make a point. The math arrived in Rose's head without her needing to reach for it. $160 a month, nearly $2,000 a year. More than $15,000 paid over time for a $12,000 machine. More than she could afford, and Frank Denton knew it. She told him so. He stood up from behind the desk and walked around to her side. His hand came down on her shoulder, heavy and warm through the worn fabric of her jacket. He said her father had left her land and a broken tractor, and that was not a plan, it was a problem. He said the smartest thing she could do was step away before it took her down with it. She stepped back just enough that his hand fell away. She told him that her father had taught her something. She said that people who tell you what you cannot do usually do not want to watch you try. Then she turned and walked to the door. Behind her the laughter came again, lower this time, directed partly at her and partly at the room, a shared acknowledgment between men who had understood one another for a long time. She heard the words that followed spoken at a volume that was not accidental. 2 words. Little girl. Rose pushed through the glass door. The March wind came off the open fields and hit her face cold and indifferent and clean. She walked to her father's truck at the curb and climbed in and started the engine. She did not drive away immediately. She sat with both hands on the steering wheel and breathed. The humiliation settled in her chest like a stone. It was real and it was heavy, and she did not pretend otherwise. She had walked 40 miles into a room and been laughed out of it, and the laughter had followed her through the door and into the street, and was sitting with her now in the cold cab of a truck that would need to be sold before long. But underneath the humiliation something else was forming, something smaller and quieter and harder to name. It did not feel like confidence. She was not a woman who confused feelings with facts. What she felt was simpler and less noble than confidence. It felt like refusal, like a line drawn somewhere in the body before the mind is fully caught up with it. She put the truck in gear and drove back toward Russell. That evening, cleaning out her father's workshop, Rose found his wedding ring on a thin chain in the bottom of his toolbox. She had not known he kept it. June had been gone for 13 years. The gold had gone dull, worn smooth. Rose stood there holding it in her palm, feeling the weight of something she could not fully articulate. Then she put the chain around her own neck and tucked the ring beneath her shirt where no one would see it. 2 weeks later, Rose drove east to a farm auction in Ellsworth County. She had scraped together $1,100 by selling her mother's remaining jewelry and her father's pickup truck. She had kept the old Chevrolet for herself, the one with the heater that worked on good days, and the passenger door that had to be lifted slightly to close. The auction notice had been small, barely a paragraph in the county paper. Estate sale, farm equipment, no reserve. The morning was cold. Wind moved hard across the open fields and carried grit and the smell of turned earth. 30 people stood in clusters in the farmyard. Men, mostly hands in coat pockets, breath visible in the sharp air. 2 tractors sat off to the side on a patch of gravel near the barn. A 1949 Farmall M and a 1953 Farmall Super M. Both were faded, the red paint lifted and peeling in long strips. The tires were cracked from years of sitting. The kind of machines people had stopped seeing because they had already decided the machines were finished. Rose saw something different. She saw equipment she recognized from the inside out. The same lines her father had run on the same models when she was small enough to ride on the fender beside him and hold on to the steering post. She knew what they sounded like when everything was right, and what they sounded like when something was wrong. She knew what they needed, and approximately what it would cost to give it to them. An older man stood near the fence on the far side of the equipment, watching the crowd with the stillness of someone who had been doing this long enough to find it unremarkable. She had seen him once or twice at the feed store in Russell. His name was Amos Reed. They had never spoken. He was watching her now. The auctioneer started the Farmall M at $2,000. The crowd held still. He came down to 1,500. Nothing moved. 1,200. Rose raised her hand and called 400. The auctioneer paused and looked at her the way auctioneers look at unexpected things. Then he nodded and asked for 5. Nobody answered. The hammer came down. The Super M drew more interest. Another bidder, a heavy-set man in a canvas coat, pushed the price up twice. Rose countered. 600. The man hesitated, calculated something behind his eyes, and stepped back. Sold. $600. Rose had spent $1,000. She had 100 left. No bank. No one coming if the math stopped working. After the sale, Amos Reed walked across the gravel toward her. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the tractors and then at her. He did not introduce himself. He asked if she knew what she had bought. She said she did. He told her the M needed a clutch. He told her the Super M needed its entire fuel system rebuilt, new wiring from one end to the other, and that the hydraulics were shot. Rose felt something drop in her stomach. She had known about the clutch. She had seen the wiring situation and considered it manageable. The hydraulics were different. That was going to cost more than she had left, more than she could get to quickly. Amos Reed watched her absorb this information. He asked again whether her father had taught her. She said he had. Amos nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he is measuring something against an internal standard that he does not explain to other people. He said she might make it, might. Then he walked away without another word. Rose stood alone on the gravel with the wind in her face and looked at the 2 tractors that were now hers. They looked worse here than they had looked at the auction. Everything does when it belongs to you and the full weight of ownership settles in. She had $100, 2 machines that did not run, and a spring planting season that would arrive whether she was ready or not. She borrowed a flatbed from Dale Hester, a neighbor who had owed her father a favor for going on 4 years. She loaded both tractors herself, using a borrowed come-along, working slowly and carefully, and drove them back to the farm in the dark. They sat in the yard under the low winter sky and looked like something already abandoned. She went inside and ate the last of the canned soup and went to bed. The workshop was cold in the mornings. Frost settled on the inside of the windows, and the concrete floor came through the soles of her boots, no matter how she stood. Rose started with the Farmall M because she knew the clutch problem, and a problem you know is easier to respect than one you do not. She pulled the clutch assembly apart over 6 days, working in the thin light from a single bare bulb that swung slightly when the wind found the gap under the workshop door. Her fingers split at the knuckles in the cold. She ordered parts from a catalog, writing out the numbers, carefully checking them twice before sealing the envelope. When the box arrived 10 days later, she opened it at the workbench and found the wrong pressure plate inside. Different bolt pattern. She would have to send it back. Wait another week. Pay return shipping both ways. $45 lost to a number she had copied correctly but that the catalog had printed wrong. She sat with that for a moment. Then she wrote the return address on a new envelope and kept working. The Super M was harder. The fuel pump rebuild required parts she could not confidently identify from the manual's diagrams, which were small and printed with the assumption that the reader already knew most of what they were looking at. She made her best estimate, ordered what seemed right. When the parts arrived, she installed them and turned the key. Nothing. The engine did not attempt to start, it did not cough, it did not hesitate, it simply sat there and produced nothing. She spent $60 on hydraulic seals before discovering she had mixed fluids that were incompatible, damaging the system she was trying to repair in the first place. Another week. Another lesson that arrived with the price attached. One afternoon, taking a break from the Super M, she opened the glove compartment to look for the vehicle paperwork she had not yet organized. A folded piece of paper fell out and landed on the floor of the cab, yellow with age, brittle at the fold lines. Her father's handwriting, precise and careful the way he wrote everything. M series reliable if you treat her right. Check hydraulics before summer heat. Keep fuel system clean. She tends to vapor lock in July. Rose sat in the cab of the Super M for a long time with that piece of paper in her hands. He had known, not that she would end up specifically with the Super M, but that she might. He had left notes inside every machine he ever worked on. She would come to understand little pieces of accumulated knowledge tucked into glove boxes and underneath seats and taped to the underside of engine covers. Breadcrumbs scattered through time toward a future he could not see but had tried to prepare for anyway. She folded the note carefully and put it back. Vera Colton drove out to the farm on a Saturday afternoon near the end of March. She was Rose's closest friend from school, the kind of friendship built in the years when you are too young to know which people will matter and which ones will fade, and you simply choose the ones you recognize something in. Vera had married Harold Colton in June of 1962, the week after graduation, and she was now 6 months along with their first child, moving carefully wearing a blue dress that had the look of something recently purchased for a body that was still changing. She brought a casserole dish wrapped in a cloth. She said she was sorry about Earl. She meant it. Rose wiped her hands on a rag that was already past helping and thanked her. Vera looked past her into the workshop. She looked at the tractors and pieces on the floor. She looked at the parts spread across the workbench in the specific organized disorder that makes sense to the person doing the organizing. Her expression shifted through several things before settling somewhere between concern and confusion. She asked Rose what she was doing. Rose said she was rebuilding. Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said that James Colton's brother worked at the grain elevator co-op and could probably get Rose a position doing office work. Filing, answering the telephone, steady hours, steady pay. Rose said she was not looking for a job. Vera said she was out here alone. Said it was too much for one person. Said it in the careful voice of someone who believes they are offering a kindness. Rose set the rag down and looked at her friend. She said it was what she had. Vera's hand moved to her belly, the unconscious gesture of a woman already thinking in a different direction, already organizing her life around something that would arrive in 3 months and change every calculation. She said she was building something too. Her voice was gentle, but there was something underneath it, a slight hardness that neither of them named. Rose said she knew. They both understood what sat between them in that workshop, in the gap between those two sentences. Two women who had grown up in the same county, gone to the same school, understood the same landscape. Now standing on opposite sides of a line they had each drawn without quite meaning to. Neither of them said the line was permanent. Neither of them said it wasn't. Vera left the casserole on the porch step and drove away the dust from the gravel road rising and thinning in the cold March light. Rose did not heat the casserole. She ate it cold that evening, standing at the kitchen counter, too tired to sit, too tired to do anything that required a decision that was not already made for her by necessity. The kitchen was quiet in the way that kitchens are quiet when someone who used to be in them is no longer there, a particular kind of absence that does not reduce with time but simply becomes familiar. She thought about Frank Denton and the way he had looked at her. She thought about Gerald Sims at the bank explaining that she needed a husband before she could have credit. She thought about the clutch disc and the wrong pressure plate and the hydraulic fluid she had mixed incorrectly and the $60 that was gone now into a lesson she would not need to learn twice. She thought about Amos Reed on the gravel by the auction fence. You might make it. Might. She finished the casserole and washed the dish and left it by the sink. Outside the fields were dark and flat under a moonless sky. The soil was still frozen but would not be frozen much longer. April came at the same speed every year, regardless of how ready anyone was for it. The ground did not ask permission. The seasons did not negotiate. Rose dried her hands and turned off the kitchen light. 3 weeks later, both tractors ran. Not smoothly, not the way something runs when it has been properly refurbished by someone with the right tools and the right time. The Farmall M coughed black smoke for the first 10 minutes every morning before settling into a rough idle that was tolerable if you did not stand too close. The Super M's hydraulics held pressure but leaked a thin thread of fluid from a fitting she had tightened 3 times and would tighten again. They were imperfect machines held together in part by correct parts and in part by the particular stubbornness of a person who does not have a backup plan. But they ran. Rose stood in the yard on a morning in early April when the frost was finally gone from the ground and the sky had that pale specific blue that comes only in Kansas in spring, when the light is clean and everything feels like it is reconsidering itself. She had both hands on the side of the Farmall M, feeling the vibration of the engine through the metal, the rough, reliable pulse of something that had been broken and was now working again. She thought about Frank Denton and his clean desk and his easy certainty. She thought about the way he had said little girl into the showroom air while she walked away. She thought about what he had been so sure of and what she knew now that he did not. She climbed up onto the Farmall M and released the clutch and drove out into the field. The soil came up dark and cold around the implement as she made the first pass. The rows were not perfect. She overlapped in some places and missed in others and would have to go back and correct the gaps. The work took longer than it should have. Her shoulders ached before noon. Neighbors driving past on the county road slowed down without stopping, their faces turned toward the field in the particular way of people who are watching something they expect to fail. She heard what was said about her at the feed store. She paid for her seed and carried the 50-pound bag to the truck herself and felt the eyes on her back the whole length of the parking lot. She stopped going to Sunday services in May because Sunday became another work day and she could not afford to treat it any other way. None of this stopped her. She was 20 years old and alone on 240 acres of Kansas farmland with $100, 2 repaired tractors, a broken porch step, and a leaking roof. She had been turned away by a bank, laughed out of a dealership, and advised by nearly everyone who offered an opinion to leave the hard part for someone better suited to it. She drove the Farmall M in straight lines across the field as the spring sun climbed and the soil turned and the season opened around her like something that had been waiting. The land did not ask if she was ready. It never does. It only ever asks what you are going to do next. And Rose Calloway, daughter of Earl Calloway, who had worked this same ground for 30 years before her, answered that question the only way she knew how. She went back to the beginning of the row and started again. The first harvest came in September, and it came in quietly the way most things that matter arrive without announcement, without ceremony, without anyone standing in a field to mark the occasion as significant. Rose brought in enough to sell. The grain elevator paid her $3,200 for the wheat and sorghum combined. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with the ledger open and worked through the numbers the way her father had taught her, column by column. No rounding, no estimating, no looking away from what the figures actually said. Seed costs, fuel, parts, the hydraulic seals she had bought 3 times before getting them right, property taxes, insurance on 2 machines that a reasonable person might have argued were not worth insuring. When she finished the subtraction, she had $1,680 in profit from her first year of farming 240 acres of Kansas soil alone. She put $1,500 in the bank. She kept $180 for emergencies, which on a working farm is not a category you budget for once and consider handled. It is a category you budget for every single month because something is always either broken or about to be. She looked at the bank book for a long time before she closed it. $1,500 saved. She needed 50,000 to feel something close to safe. At this pace, with no bad years, no broken equipment she could not handle herself, no drought, no disease moving through the county, no price collapse in the grain markets, no unexpected tax assessment, no disaster of any kind arriving from any of the dozen directions that disaster typically finds its way onto a working farm, she would reach $50,000 in 30 years. She was 20 years old. She closed the ledger and went to bed. The winter that followed was quieter than the first one had been, not easier but quieter. The sharp edge of crisis had passed, replaced by something longer and less dramatic, and in its own way more demanding. Crisis is almost simple because it requires only one response: survive. What comes after crisis requires something more complicated. It requires patience that does not look like patience from the inside, but looks very much like stubbornness from the outside. And the difference between the two is mostly a question of whether you eventually turn out to be right. Rose spent the winter months doing maintenance on both tractors, going over every system, methodically replacing what was worn, adjusting what had drifted, cleaning what had accumulated the grime of a full season's work. She read farm reports from Kansas State that arrived in the county extension office and that she picked up whenever she drove to town, reading them at the kitchen table in the evenings with the radio low and the wind working at the windows. She read about soil, about what it was made of beneath the surface and what it needed and what happened when you took from it without returning. She read about rotation and cover crops and the long, slow process by which organic matter builds in ground that is managed carefully over years. Some of what she read matched things she had seen her father do without ever fully explaining. Planting rye in sections after harvest, leaving certain fields fallow in a pattern that had seemed random to her as a child but she now understood was deliberate. She was building a picture. She did not yet have all of it. That came later. That came on a December afternoon when she went to force open a stuck drawer. She had been cleaning the workshop, organizing the tools her father had kept with a precision that she was only now beginning to fully appreciate each thing in its place, each place chosen for a reason that made sense once you had used the tool enough times to understand why proximity to certain other tools mattered. The bottom drawer of his main workbench had been stuck since she arrived. She had noted it and moved past it a dozen times, telling herself she would deal with it when she had the time, which on a working farm is how small things become, things you discover only by accident much later. She gripped the handle and pulled. Nothing. She braced her foot against the bottom of the bench frame and put her weight into it. The wood groaned. Something shifted inside. She pulled again harder, and the drawer broke free so suddenly that she nearly fell backward, catching herself against the opposite bench with both hands. She looked at what was inside. Dozens of small notebooks, the kind sold at the hardware store, 3 for $1, rubber banded in groups of 4 or 5. Loose papers covered in her father's handwriting, organized in a way that took her several minutes to understand. Receipts and soil sample records and yield comparisons going back to 1941. And beneath all of it, sitting at the very bottom of the drawer, a leather journal worn soft from years of handling, dark at the corners, where it had been opened and set down and picked up again more times than she could count. She lifted it out carefully. The leather was warm in her hands in the way that objects become warm when they have been handled by someone you loved for a very long time. She opened to the first page. Her father's handwriting, neat and precise the way he wrote when something mattered enough to take care with. Year 1 field notes. If you are reading this, I did not get to show you. Rose stood in the cold workshop with the journal in her hands and did not move for a long time. She read through the night. She read the next day and the day after that. 3 days in which she barely ate and did not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch, living inside her father's mind through ink and paper, and the particular discipline of a man who had believed that what he observed was worth recording precisely because no one else was going to do it for him. 23 years of field notes. Soil samples taken from every section of the farm and labeled by location and date and depth. Yield comparisons that made sense only when you understood they were not comparing one year against another, but one method against another, the same ground treated differently in adjacent sections, so that the results could be measured against something real instead of against theory. Cover crop trials. Water retention tests conducted with equipment that cost nothing and produced results that cost nothing to understand if you were willing to pay attention. What she had believed was luck, the way her father's fields had consistently outperformed the county average in years when other farms struggled, was not luck at all. It was strategy. Documented, tested, refined over 2 decades in notebooks that had been sitting in a stuck drawer in a cold workshop while she taught herself to do by instinct what he had already proven by method. The final entry was written in a hand slightly less steady than the rest, the letters formed with care, but not with the ease of earlier pages. He had written it in the fall of the year he died. He wrote her name at the top, not Rose, the name he had called her since she was small. Emmy, if you are reading this, I did not finish. The land is better than it looks. I have been building it for you. I should have told you more of what I knew. I kept thinking there was more time. Trust the soil. It will not let you down. Rose put the journal down on the workbench and sat on the metal stool in the corner of the workshop and cried for the first time since the funeral. not from grief alone, though grief was part of it. She cried because she understood something now that she had not understood before. She had not inherited a problem. She had not inherited a burden that others had the wisdom to walk away from. She had inherited 23 years of preparation made by a man who had known he might not be there to explain it. Spring planting in 1964 looked different. Not to anyone watching from the county road. The tractors were the same, and the fields were the same, and the woman driving them was the same woman who had been driving them the year before. But Rose planted with the journal open on the kitchen table every evening, cross-referencing what the notes said about each section against what she was observing herself. The wheat went where her father had noted the soil held moisture longest. The sorghum went in the sections that drained better. After harvest, instead of leaving the ground bare through the winter the way most farmers in the county did, she planted cover crops. Rye in the southern sections, clover in the north. Glenn Purvis stopped his truck on the road one afternoon in October and watched her seeding clover into ground she had just harvested from. He rolled his window down and called across the fence. He asked what she was planting. She told him. He asked if she was planning to sell it. She said she was planting it for the soil. His face arranged itself into the expression of a man who has heard something that does not compute. He said her father had done the same thing, said it had never made sense to him. Rose looked at him across the fence. She asked whether it had made sense to him when her father's yields were better than his. Glenn Purvis put his truck in gear without answering and drove away with the gravel cracking under his tires. The years between 1964 and 1970 were not easy years. There is no such thing on a working farm. But they were years of a particular kind of difficulty that has something useful in it, the kind of difficulty that comes from doing hard things in a direction you believe in, where each year adds something even when the year itself costs more than it returns. The first cover crop year produced results she could see with her hands. The soil in the clover sections had a different quality in spring, darker and more yielding under her fingers, holding moisture in the second week of May, when the section Glenn Purvis farmed on the other side of the fence line had already started to crust over at the surface. 1969 brought a late frost that took a portion of the wheat in the county. Rose lost 8%. The farm 2 miles north of her lost 22. She did not celebrate this. She noted it in her own journal, the one she had started keeping, and moved forward. 1970 was better. 1971 was not. May of 1971 came dry. June came drier. By the middle of July, Russell County had gone 68 days without meaningful rain. The soil cracked in fields that had not been managed with water retention in mind. Crops that had been planted in ground that gave up its moisture quickly ran out of resources before the grain could finish. Other farms lost 40 and 50% of their crops that summer. Glenn Purvis lost 44. A farm east of Russell that had been in the same family since 1908 lost its entire sorghum planting and most of the wheat. Rose lost 20%. Not a good year. 20% of a small operation still hurts. That year she netted negative $1,800 and the bank account dropped for the first time since she had started building it. She sat with that number and felt what it felt like to go backward after years of going forward. The feeling was specific and unpleasant, and she let herself feel it fully because she had learned that looking away from a hard number was how you ended up surprised by it again later. But she also understood something the loss had demonstrated. The soil her father had built and that she had continued to build had functioned during a drought the way a deep-rooted thing functions. It had not been immune, but the roots had reached water that shallower ground could not access. The organic matter had held moisture that had long since evaporated from fields where the soil had been treated as a medium for production rather than a system with its own logic. Even good soil was not magic. Weather could still hurt you. Planning could still fail. All you could do was give yourself the best possible chance and accept that chance was part of the equation whether you accounted for it or not. It was in the difficult middle years somewhere around 1972 that Dale Osborne came around. He was 35 years old, pleasant-faced, always smiling, always working towards something at an angle that made the angle hard to see until you were already inside it. He farmed around 100 acres north of Russell, though people who knew him said he spent more time looking for the easier version of every problem than he spent working through the harder one. He had an easy way of talking that made you feel comfortable and an easy way of listening that made you feel understood, and both of these things were genuine enough to be convincing until they were not. He came to Rose at the feed store and told her he was looking to expand. Said he had heard she was farming all 240 acres herself and asked whether she had considered leasing some of it out. Said he would pay fair $15 an acre cash up front every April 1st. Rose did the math where she always did it in her head before her expression changed. 60 acres at $15 was $900. That was more than half a year's net profit for doing nothing, for letting someone else work ground she would be working herself anyway. She needed the money. Her savings were just over $2,000, which was real progress from the year she had started, but was not safety, by any definition, she trusted. She told him she would think about it. She went home and thought about it for 3 days. The journal said nothing about leasing. It had no entries on the subject because her father had never leased and had never seemed to consider it. But the journal also said nothing about every problem that would arise, and she was not going to be paralyzed by what it did not contain. She told Osborne yes. 60 acres the south section 1 year to start. They sat at her kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, and Rose wrote out the agreement herself longhand, 2 copies. Payment due April 1st. Land returned in the same condition or better. Standard rotation, she wrote, which she assumed meant what she meant by it, which was the same standard her father had applied, which was a high one. She would come to understand that the word standard does not mean the same thing to every person who signs their name beneath it. Merle Hutchins paid on time the first year. The $900 arrived on April 1st in an envelope cash, and Rose counted it at the kitchen table and put it in the bank account the same afternoon. It was good to feel money arrive without her having to push a tractor through a field to earn it. The second year Merle was late. 3 weeks late. Rose drove to his place on a Thursday morning and found him in the yard working on a disc blade with a wrench and the particular focused expression of a man who knows someone is coming to ask for something. She told him the rent was due. He said he knew, said he had some unexpected costs, said he would get it to her next week. She looked at the section she had leased him and said nothing about what she saw there. The compaction starting at the edges of the rows where he had taken equipment into the field too wet. She noted it in her mind, the way she noted everything carefully, with the intention of acting on it at the appropriate time. He paid 10 days later. Bills that smelled like cigarette smoke counted out on the tailgate of his truck. The third year, Merle Hutchins did not pay at all. April passed. May. Rose left word at his farm twice. She drove past his place and could see equipment working in the south section. her south section, and no envelope appeared in her mailbox, and no phone call came, and no explanation arrived in any form. In July, she drove to his place and found him loading hay bales into a truck. She told him he owed her $900. He straightened up and took off his cap and put it back on in the single motion of a man buying himself a moment. He said the farm had been tight, she knew how it was. He said it with the ease of someone who has used that particular sentence before and found it to be effective. Rose told him the contract was clear. He looked at her with the expression that had replaced the pleasant one, something harder underneath it now that had probably been there all along. He told her to take it to court. He said it in the voice of a man who knows something the other person does not know yet. The lawyer's office was above the pharmacy on 2nd Street. His name was Orville Pratt, 40 years old, a careful and unhurried man, who had handled farm disputes in Russell County long enough to have seen most of the ways they could go wrong. He read the contract Rose had written at her kitchen table in 15 minutes. He told her it was not great. She asked him what that meant specifically. He said that the phrase standard rotation was not legally defined and would be difficult to enforce in a farm court. He said the terms around land condition were vague in ways that a good opposing attorney would use. He said she could probably recover the unpaid rent, but the damages to the soil would be harder to quantify in a way that held up. He told her it was going to cost money to pursue and that she should understand that going in. The consultation fee was $50 she could not spare. The trial took 1 day in county court. Merle Hutchins arrived with his own attorney, a younger man from Hayes who wore a good suit and talked with the practiced fluency of someone who had learned that speed and confidence in an argument can sometimes substitute for the strength of the argument itself. Rose sat at the plaintiff's table in the dress she had worn to her father's funeral, the only good thing she owned, and presented her case with the same precision she brought to every column in a ledger. The judge ruled from the bench. Contract terms too vague to enforce specific farming practices. Unpaid rent was owed. Merle Hutchins was ordered to pay $900 plus $300 in damages for documented soil degradation. Rose's legal fees came to $640. She drove home and sat at the kitchen table and worked through the arithmetic with the same discipline she always brought to numbers, even the ones she did not want to look at directly. 900 plus 300 was 1,200. Minus 640 in legal fees was $560 recovered. 3 years of rent. 3 years of soil work undone in a leased section that would take 2 or 3 more years to recover fully. A lesson in the difference between what you intend when you sign something and what the paper actually says when someone holds it up in a courtroom. She had made this mistake herself. No one had deceived her into it. She had sat at her own kitchen table and written a contract that did not say what she meant it to say, and she had done it because she assumed good faith on the other side, which was an assumption she would not make again in the same way. Vera Colton came by that evening. She had heard. Word moved through Russell County the way weather moved fast and low and touching everything. She sat on the stool by the workbench while Rose organized tools that were already organized, and she said the things she believed were kind. She said this was why she worried. Said a husband could have handled Dale Osborne, could have dealt with the lawyer, could have made sure the contract said what it needed to say. Rose did not look up from the workbench. She said that she could learn to handle it herself, or she could not. But that was the thing she intended to find out. Vera left without finishing her coffee for the second time in as many years. The friendship was still there between them, but it had taken on a particular quality the way a photograph takes on a quality of distance over time, still recognizable but no longer immediate. The years that followed blurred together in the way that years do when you are too occupied to observe them closely. They accumulated instead of passing, each one adding something small and specific to what she knew and what she owned. In 1975, Carl Braddock appeared. He ran the farm lending division at Russell First National, the same bank that had told Rose to come back with a husband 12 years before. He was professional and precisely dressed in the manner of a man who understands that appearance in a rural community is a form of communication, and that the communication he wanted to produce was one of stability and seriousness. He found her at the co-op in October near the seed display and introduced himself as though they had not been banking at the same institution for over a decade. He said he had been looking at her account. He said $32,000 in savings was impressive, that most farmers her age were leveraged significantly. He said this as a compliment, but she heard it as an opener. He told her land prices were strong and trending higher, said she could buy another 160 acres with 10% down, that he could get her 8% interest over 7 years, that her $32,000 would generate considerably more value with leverage behind it. Rose looked at him and asked what happened if prices dropped. Carl Braddock laughed. It was a short sound, efficient, the kind of laugh that is meant to close a question rather than engage with it. He said land values had not declined in 10 years. Said land was the safest investment available. She told him that 10 years of a pattern was not a guarantee of the next 10. He said she was leaving money on the table. Said everyone was expanding. Said she was going to get left behind. She thanked him for his time. He walked away shaking his head, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was categorizing her in the way that people categorize others when they want to stop thinking about them. She watched him go and then turned back to the seed display and finished what she had come to the co-op to do.
All around her, the county was doing exactly what Carl Braddock was recommending. Glenn Purvis bought 200 more acres in 1974 and leased another 100 on top of that. Curtis Langdon bought a new combine that year, the kind that could harvest 100 acres in 2 days, $40,000 on a 10-year note. Frank Denton was building an addition on the south side of the dealership. The lot was full of machines that cost more than Rose's entire farm was worth. She drove past it sometimes on the way to town and watched the men signing papers in the showroom through the plate glass windows and did not stop.
She stayed disciplined. Same acreage, same system, the same slow, careful accumulation of soil, capital and financial capital in parallel, each reinforcing the other in ways that did not show up in anyone else's ledger but showed up clearly in hers. By 1978, she had $48,000 in the bank. That fall, Frank Denton drove out to the farm for the second time since the first visit in 1966. He pulled up in a new truck that still had the dealer sticker on the window and found Rose in the north field checking on an irrigation concern she had noted in August. He told her he respected what she had done. He said it with the particular generosity of a man who believes he is offering something by saying it. Then he said she was leaving money on the table, said she could be running 600 acres by now. She said she could also be owing money on 600 acres. He told her that was how wealth was built, through leverage, through borrowing when rates were favorable and expanding when land was available. She said that was how debt was built, that debt was not the same thing. He said debt was a tool, and that the people who refused to use tools did not get very far. She looked at him for a moment before answering. She said the people who used tools incorrectly did not get very far either, and that the difference between a tool and a trap was sometimes only visible from the other side of the experience. Frank Denton drove away without a response. She watched his truck until it was out of sight and then went back to the north field. In late 1980, a letter arrived from the county assessor's office. Standard envelope. Official letterhead. The kind of mail that looks administrative until you read the third paragraph. Rose stood at the kitchen table and read it 3 times. There was a lien on the property. A lien from 1961. $2,400 borrowed against the land by Earl Calloway, secured against the title with payment records, showing partial satisfaction, but not full resolution. Balance due, $2,400. Payment required within 90 days, or the property would be subject to tax auction proceedings. She read it a 4th time. Her father had borrowed against the land 19 years before she found this letter. He had paid most of it back, but not all of it. And then he had carried that remaining balance in silence for nearly 2 decades, never mentioning it, keeping it away from her the way a man keeps a hand over a cut. He does not want to explain. The anger came first, clear and sharp, directed inward as much as outward. She had spent 17 years building on ground she believed was clean, and it was not entirely clean, and she had not known because he had not told her. Then something else arrived behind the anger, slower and less clean. She had read 23 years of her father's journals. She knew how he thought about problems. She knew that he had built the soil and saved the farm and prepared what he could for the person who would come after him. She knew that the lien was not negligence. It was protection. He had not wanted her to carry the knowledge of a debt she could not pay when she was 7 years old, and had just lost her mother, or when she was 14, or when she was 20, and had just lost him. He had carried it because he could, and because that was the kind of man he was. She wrote a check for $2,400 that same afternoon. She drove it to the county office herself and waited while the clerk processed it and watched the clerk apply the official stamp to the receipt and handed it back to her with both hands, the paper slightly warm from the stamp. The bank account dropped to $87,200. She drove home. She did not tell anyone about the letter. She filed the receipt in the ledger alongside the deed and the property tax records and the survey maps, and she sat for a long time at the kitchen table before she went to bed. Her father had not been perfect. She had known this in an abstract way since she was old enough to understand that no person is. But this was the first time she had held specific evidence of it in her hands, and what surprised her was not the imperfection, but the feeling it produced. Not disappointment, not revision of what she had believed about him. Something else, something closer to recognition. The kind that comes when you see a person fully including the parts they tried to keep out of sight and find that the whole is not diminished but enlarged. He had made mistakes. He had carried burdens alone that should have been shared. He had prepared what he could and hidden what he thought might hurt her. And he had been right about some of it and wrong about some of it. And he had left her everything he had without knowing if it would be enough. That was what a father was, she understood now. Not a legend. A person trying. The world started changing in 1981. In the way that large things change, not suddenly, but in increments that each seem manageable until you look back from a distance and understand that the increments were always adding up to the same destination. Interest rates that had been sitting at 8 and 9% began to climb. 10, 12. By mid-1981, they were above 15. The rate movement was not happening to farming specifically, it was happening to the entire economy. But farming operated on margins that other industries did not, and debt that had been manageable at 8% became something different when the rate crossed 15. Grain prices that had been rising steadily for a decade flattened. Then they began to fall. Wheat dropped from 4.50 a bushel to 4.20, then to 4, then to 3.80. Land values that had climbed year over year for 20 years stalled. Then they turned. The farmers who had borrowed at 8% to buy land at peak prices found themselves holding notes whose terms had not changed, but whose weight had. The land they had purchased as collateral was now worth less than what they owed on it. The grain they were selling to service those notes was selling for less than it had cost to grow. Curtis Langdon went to the bank in spring of 1981 to refinance his equipment loans and was told no. He sold 80 acres at a loss to cover the shortfall. He still owed $60,000 on equipment that was depreciating and grain that was falling. Frank Denton's dealership slowed, then it slowed further. Farmers who had been eager buyers 18 months before were asking for extended terms and returning machinery they could not afford to keep. The new addition on the south side of the building, the one Rose had watched go up from the county road, sat half empty. Glen Purvis came to her at church in late summer of 1981, standing in the parking lot with the look of a man who has spent the last several months doing arithmetic that keeps producing the wrong answer. He said he was carrying too much, said the interest rate had gone from 8% to 18 and his payment had more than doubled, said he could not cover it. Rose asked if he could sell some land. He told her at what price and what the land was currently worth, and the math was clear between them without either of them needing to say it out loud. He would still owe more than he cleared. She said she was sorry. He said her father had been smarter than all of them. Then he walked away across the parking lot with the movement of a man going somewhere he did not want to go. And she watched him and understood that there was nothing she could say that would be adequate to what he was walking toward. The winter of 1981 into 1982 was long. Rose kept herself busy with maintenance and planning and the kind of careful anticipatory work that distinguishes the farmer who will still be farming in 5 years from the one who will not. She went over the books the way she always did, looking for every place where a cost could be reduced without reducing the capacity of the operation, holding every expense up against the question of whether it was contributing to the long term or only to the present. She had $87,000 in savings, zero debt, land that was fully paid for, equipment that was old and in good condition and capable of doing everything she needed it to do. She knew what those numbers meant in the context of what was happening around her. She also knew that knowing your position is not the same as feeling safe in it, and that feeling safe was not something she had permitted herself in enough quantity to mistake it for a permanent state. February came and the days were short and the cold settled in the particular way that Kansas cold settles in. Not violent, but relentless, the kind that does not give you a warm afternoon to pretend it is passing. She drove into Russell on a Tuesday morning because the livestock feed was low and the drive was ordinary, and she did not think anything particular about it until she found herself at the intersection of Main and Second, taking the turn that did not go to the feed store. She told herself she was cold and needed a moment. She told herself it was nothing. She pulled over across the street from Frank Denton's dealership and left the engine running and sat with both hands on the wheel. The lot was quieter than it had been, fewer tractors out front. The lights were on inside and she could see figures moving behind the plate glass, but the movement was slower than it had been, more tentative. The movement of a place that was no longer sure of itself. She sat there and let herself think about what it would feel like to stop. She had been working for 19 years without a single year that did not ask something significant of her. She had buried her father and fixed two broken tractors with $100 and no backup plan. She had been laughed at and turned down and advised to give up by people who were certain they knew better. She had sued a man for rent he owed her and recovered less than she spent recovering it. She had found her father's debt in a letter from the county and paid it and filed the receipt and gone to bed without telling anyone. She had watched her neighbors borrow into a future that was now arriving ahead of schedule to collect what they owed. All of this was true. All of it was hers. The easy version of the next chapter existed. It was available right now across the street behind a glass door she had walked through once before in the other direction. Frank Denton would not laugh this time. He would listen. He would call Roy Fenner or someone like him, someone with money and acreage who wanted more. Papers would be drawn up. A check would arrive once a year. She could keep the house. She could get a job in town at the grain elevator office, at the pharmacy, at the hardware store. She could sleep through the night. Her hand moved to the door handle. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal. She looked up and saw herself in the side mirror. The jacket was her father's. She had been wearing it for 19 years and it had never fit correctly and she had never replaced it. The collar was worn through on one side. The elbows were gone. Her hands on the wheel were the hands of a woman who had been working for 19 years, stained and calloused, and capable in the specific way that comes only from doing the work and not from anything else. She thought about her father at the kitchen sink after supper, the way he stood looking out the window toward the west field, in the particular quiet of a man who has done what he set out to do for that day and knows it. Not triumphant, not relieved, just present in his own life in a way that was complete. He had said something once while they were working on the old farm all years before she understood what he meant by it. He had said the land does not ask if you feel ready. It only asks what you are going to do next. She had thought at the time it was the kind of thing older people said to make plain facts sound larger than they were. She understood now what he had meant. He had not been offering encouragement. He had been describing a condition. The work does not wait for certainty. The season does not negotiate. What you owe the ground is not confidence. What you owe it is presence. Rose's hand came off the door handle. She sat back in the seat. She let the heat from the engine warm the cab around her and breathed steadily and let the moment pass through her the way a wave passes through something that is rooted, moving it but not taking it. Then she put the truck in gear and drove to the feed store and bought what she had come to buy and loaded it herself and drove home. She never told anyone about that morning, not because she was ashamed of how close it had been, though it had been close. She kept it quiet because she understood something about the way stories get told afterward, about how strength looks continuous from a distance, when it was not continuous at all, when it was in fact a series of separate decisions, made one at a time by a person who was not certain, who was afraid, in the way that anyone doing a hard thing over many years becomes afraid who chose to stay, not because she was sure it would work out, but because the alternative felt like the wrong kind of relief. She went home and kept working. Outside the fields were frozen and still under the February sky, waiting, the way they always waited, patient and indifferent and permanent, in a way that she had learned over 19 years to find not oppressive but clarifying. The ground did not care about her doubts. It only cared about what she did next. She had an answer to that question. She had had the same answer for 19 years. By the spring of 1982, the auctions had become part of the county calendar, the way planting season was part of the calendar, not an event but a condition, something you factored into your planning because it was going to happen whether you planned for it or not. Russell County had 3 foreclosure auctions in March alone. People stopped asking whether there would be one and started asking whose place was next. The question had changed, and the change in the question said everything about how much had shifted in a very short time. Rose went to Glen Purvis's auction in April. She did not want to go. She drove there anyway because not going felt like a way of pretending that what was happening was not happening, and pretending had never been a practice she allowed herself, not with numbers, not with weather, not with the condition of the people around her. The equipment was lined up in rows in the farmyard, organized by category, the way auctioneers organize things. Tractors in one row, implements in another, the smaller tools and shop equipment in a third row near the barn. $260,000 worth of machinery. When Glenn had bought it, most of it between 1972 and 1978, when the future had seemed to be pointing in a single clear direction. The auctioneer estimated it would bring 80,000, maybe 90 if the bidding went well. It brought 74. Glenn stood near the barn with his wife Norma and their 2 youngest children. The older kids were grown and gone. Norma was not crying, or she was trying not to, which from a distance looked the same. Glenn's face had gone to something past expression, the specific blankness that arrives when feeling anything at all would break something that cannot be repaired quickly enough to be useful. Rose stood at the back of the crowd and watched people she had known for 20 years pick through the pieces of a life that had been assembled over the same 20 years she had been assembling her own. A man from 2 counties over bought the combine. A farm corporation she did not recognize outbid 3 local buyers on the 2 large tractors. Glenn's shop tools went for 40 cents on the dollar to men who looked at the ground while they bid, not comfortable but practical, doing the thing that needed doing. Rose bought nothing. She had not come to buy. She had come because bearing witness to something is different from knowing it happened, and the difference matters even when no one is keeping score. This could have been her. That was the thought she let herself have, standing in the back of that farmyard fully and without softening it. If she had listened to Carl Braddock in 1975 and borrowed against her savings to expand, if she had believed that 10 years of rising land prices meant the 11th year was safe, if she had done what everyone around her had been doing because everyone around her was doing it, and the people selling the idea had clean hands and confident voices and charts that pointed upward, she would be standing where Glenn was standing. The difference between her position and his was not virtue. It was not superior intelligence or greater discipline or some essential quality she possessed that he lacked. Glen Purvis was a hard worker and a decent man who had believed a story that turned out to have an ending no one had mentioned when they were selling the beginning. The difference was that her father had built soil for 23 years and left her a journal that taught her the same patience applied to money that it applied to ground. The difference was inheritance, not character. She drove home from the auction and did not feel relieved. She felt something colder and more complicated than relief. She felt the weight of having been positioned correctly by forces she had not fully controlled, and she felt the responsibility that came with that position, and she felt the grief of a community that was contracting around her in ways that could not be undone quickly. The following spring brought the auction that changed the shape of her farm for the rest of her working life. It was a Saturday morning in May of 1983, clear and cool, the kind of Kansas spring morning that makes everything look specific and clean-edged. The sky a hard blue, the new leaves on the elms along the county road lit up from underneath. Leonard Webb's place. 160 acres sharing a fence line with Rose's southern boundary. Leonard Webb was 52 years old. He had bought those acres in 1976 for $140,000, borrowing 80%, which was what the bank had offered and what nearly every serious farmer in the county had been doing in 1976, because the math made sense when you ran it at the interest rates and grain prices that existed in 1976. He had maintained the land well. His fence lines were tight. His soil was in reasonable condition. There was nothing wrong with Leonard Webb's farming that explained what had happened to him, which was precisely what made standing in his yard on a Saturday morning in May feel the way it felt. The auctioneer opened at $100,000 for the land itself. The yard was quiet. He came down to 80,000. A few people shifted their weight, calculations happening behind eyes that gave nothing away. 60,000 brought more movement, more calculation, a couple of brief conversations between men standing close to one another, and then more silence. Rose raised her hand at $55,000. An older farmer she recognized from the grain elevator, a man named Ed Carver, who farmed 400 acres south of town, looked at her and then at his wife and then raised his hand and said 60. Rose said 65. Ed Carver looked at the land and then at the sky and then at Rose, and she watched him make his calculation, watched him arrive at the conclusion that whatever he was willing to spend, he had already spent, and he stepped back. The auctioneer called the number once, twice. Let the silence gather for a long moment, looking out over the yard for anyone who wanted to contest it. $68,000, Rose said, and her voice carried across the yard the way a voice carries in open country when the wind is not working against it. The hammer came down. The whispers started while the sound of the hammer was still in the air. She could hear them without making out the specific words, the collective murmur of a crowd recalibrating its understanding of something. A few people turned to look at her directly. She recognized the expression on their faces, the same expression she had seen on the auctioneer's face at the Ellsworth County sale 20 years before, the look of someone encountering an outcome they had not accounted for. That is the Calloway woman. Where did she get that kind of money? She could not hear the words, but she knew the words. She had been the subject of that particular sentence in one form or another since she was 20 years old. Frank Denton was standing at the far edge of the yard near the gate hat, pulled low hands in his coat pockets. She saw him when she looked up from signing the preliminary paperwork. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read from that distance and did not particularly need to read up close. She finished signing. She shook hands with Leonard Webb's attorney, a thin man in a gray suit who had the careful professional composure of someone performing a task that he did not enjoy, but that he had been hired to perform correctly. She walked to her truck. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. She had earned this moment by 20 years of decisions that most of the people in that yard had been advising her against for most of those 20 years. She had been laughed at and dismissed and pitied and warned and offered better alternatives by people who were certain they understood her situation more clearly than she did. And now she was the one buying land at 50 cents on the dollar with cash from an account that had grown not through risk or leverage or the kind of bold expansion that the Carl Braddocks of the world called opportunity, but through patience and the slow accumulation of what you did not spend. She did not feel triumphant. She felt sad for Leonard Webb, who had done the right things by the standard of the time and had been undone by the time changing. She felt the weight of what it meant to benefit from someone else's disaster, even when the disaster was not your doing. She felt something that she would later think of as the particular loneliness of being right about something that hurt people you did not wish to hurt. She drove home and entered the purchase in the ledger and went out to check the south fence line, which was now the boundary between her land and more of her land, and she walked it in the late afternoon light without celebrating anything. The pattern continued. In 1985, she bought 80 acres from the estate of a farmer named Rupert Haynes, who had died in February, and whose children, all of whom lived in cities, wanted the land converted to cash as quickly as possible. $31,000 paid in full at closing. In 1987, she bought another 120 acres at an estate sale east of Russell, $54,000, the same terms. She was not reckless. She was not greedy. Each purchase was measured against what she had, what she needed to keep, and what the land was actually worth by the measure of the soil and the water and the long-term capacity of the ground to produce, which was a different calculation than what it was worth by the measure of current market prices, and the difference between those two calculations was where she found her opportunities. By 1988, Rose Calloway owned 600 acres of Russell County farmland, every acre paid for. No mortgage, no operating note, no debt of any kind attached to any part of it. She was 45 years old. The county looked different now from how it had looked when she started. Fewer lights on in farmhouses after dark. Fewer tractors working in fields on late summer evenings. The landscape had not changed, but the density of human activity within it had thinned, drawn away by foreclosures and sales, and the quiet departure of families who had been in the county for 2 and 3 generations, and who left without announcement, whose absence was noted gradually, in the way you note the absence of something you had stopped consciously perceiving because it had always been there. Frank Denton's dealership closed on a Thursday morning in October of 1986. There was no ceremony, no announcement beyond what the creditors required by law. The doors were locked, and the windows went dark, and the inventory that had not yet been repossessed was tagged for liquidation by the bank's representatives, men in city clothes who moved through the showroom with clipboards and the brisk efficiency of people performing a task that has no emotional content for them. The bank had called his note after 3 consecutive years of declining revenue. Too many farmers who had bought equipment on credit could not make their payments. Too much inventory sitting on a lot that had once turned over quickly. The model that had worked for 25 years had stopped working, and the bank did not wait for sentiment or history when the numbers no longer supported the relationship. Frank Denton was 68 years old. He had built that business from a single bay service shop in 1961 into the largest John Deere dealership in 3 counties. He had survived a dozen difficult years and emerged from each of them believing that the model was sound and that the difficulties were temporary and that the next season would confirm what he had always believed about how farming worked and what farmers needed. He was wrong about the season. He was wrong about the model. He had believed in something that had been true for long enough to become indistinguishable from permanent, and then it had stopped being true, and the stopping had been fast. Rose was in the workshop that evening, replacing a drive belt on the Farmall M, which she kept running, not because she needed it for primary field work anymore, but because she had kept it running for 23 years. And the habit of maintenance is harder to break than most habits once it has been properly formed when she heard tires on the gravel in the yard. She stepped out of the workshop. Frank Denton was sitting in a Ford pickup at the edge of the yard, the engine idling, his hands resting on the top of the steering wheel in the posture of a man who has driven somewhere without being entirely certain why. He looked older than the last time she had seen him. Not just in years, though there were years in it. The particular aging that comes when the thing a person has organized their confidence around is no longer there to lean against. Rose walked across the yard and stopped a few feet from the passenger window. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. He told her he had closed the dealership that morning. She said she had heard. She said she was sorry. He let out a breath that was not quite a laugh but had the shape of one. He said after everything he had told her she was sorry. She told him that losing something you built was hard, that it did not matter particularly who you were when the losing happened. He was quiet for a moment, looking out through the windshield at the workshop behind her, at the yard, at the two Farmall tractors visible through the open workshop door, the M and the Super M, both old enough now to be antiques, and both still running, because she had kept them running through every year that had passed since she brought them home on a borrowed flatbed for $1,000. He said he had called her a little girl, said he had told her she would fail before her first harvest was in, said those tractors were not worth the trouble and that the land was too much for one person, and that the smart thing was to step away before it took her down. Rose waited. She understood that he needed to say this, not for her benefit particularly, but because there are certain things a person has to put into words where they can be heard before those things can be put down. He said he had pushed every farmer in the county to take on more than they should have. Said he had made it sound not just reasonable but necessary. Said he had believed it. Said grow or die leverage or fall behind bigger is always better. Debt is just a tool in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. Said all of it with complete conviction for 25 years because he had watched it work for long enough to stop questioning whether it would keep working. He said, and did not finish the sentence. The silence completed it more accurately than any ending he might have found. Rose told him that no one had forced anyone to sign anything. He said no, said that was true, said he had not forced anything. He had only made it easy. He had made the path of least resistance run straight through the showroom floor and into a loan agreement and out the other side into a future he had been confident about and should not have been confident about, and that confidence had cost people things they could not recover. He looked past her toward the workshop at the two tractors in the light from the bare bulb inside. He asked if they were still running. She said every day. He looked at them for a long time. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. A small involuntary expression that appeared and then settled back into the tiredness. He said $1,000 for both. Said it was the best investment he had ever seen and that he had not even made it. He put the truck in gear. He sat for a moment longer with his hands on the wheel, and she thought he might say something else, but he did not. He pulled out of the yard slowly and drove down the gravel road toward the county road, and she stood in the yard and listened to the sound of his engine until it thinned out into the larger quiet of the evening. She did not feel that she had won anything. The shape of victory did not fit the moment, and she did not try to force it. Frank Denton was not a bad man. He had been a certain man, and certainty that turns out to be wrong is not the same thing as malice, even when its consequences look similar from the outside. He had believed in a model and pushed others toward it, and the model had failed, and the failure had cost people their farms and their savings, and in some cases their sense of who they were, and none of that had been his intention. That was how most of the large harms got done, she had come to understand over the years. Not through malice, through certainty, through the particular confidence of a person who has been right enough times to stop seriously considering whether they might be wrong. She went back into the workshop and finished replacing the drive belt. Vera Colton came back that same fall on a Wednesday afternoon in October, driving the Chevrolet she had owned for 12 years, the rust working up around the wheel wells, now the paint gone dull. Harold had lost 80 acres the previous year when his equipment loans came due and the bank declined to refinance. Not a total loss. Not the kind of loss that required an auction, but enough to change things, to narrow the margins in ways that did not narrow back. Rose was in the workshop organizing the tool wall when she heard the car door. She walked out into the late afternoon light and saw Vera standing in the yard with her hands in her coat pockets, looking around at the farm the way a person looks at something they have been thinking about for a long time and are now finally seeing directly. Vera said she had heard Rose bought the Tatum place, the Webb place, the Haynes land east of town. Rose said she had. Vera looked at the workshop, at the tools on the pegboard visible through the open door, at everything in its place, at the whole operation that had the particular quality of something that has been maintained consistently over a long time, not perfect, not showroom clean, but correct in the deep sense of a thing that is used properly and cared for accordingly. She said she used to think Rose was crazy, said it plainly and without building up to it. Rose waited. Vera said that back when they were 20 years old, when Rose was out here covered in grease trying to fix tractors that were older than they were, and Vera was getting married and building something she could see the shape of and understand, she had been completely certain that Rose was making a mistake. Said she had pitied her, which was worse than thinking her wrong. Said she had sat in her kitchen and told Harold that Rose Calloway would be in town working at the diner before summer was out. Rose said that was a reasonable prediction at the time. Vera said no, it was not. Said she had been certain in the way that Frank Denton had been certain. And for the same reason, because the thing she was doing looked like the obvious thing, and the thing Rose was doing looked like nothing. Said certainty without curiosity was not a virtue, and she had been practicing it for 20 years without knowing that was what she was doing. She asked if they could have coffee. Said real coffee, not the kind where they pretended everything was fine and stayed on the surface of things. Rose said yes. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. The same table where Earl had planned seasons and where Rose had learned to read a ledger, and where the arithmetic of 20 years of farming had been worked out column by column. They talked the way people talk when they have stopped protecting themselves from the truth of what they want to say. Vera admitted the jealousy. Said watching Rose succeed while her own life had gotten harder had produced something ugly in her that she was not proud of. A need to find fault, a need to locate the cost of what Rose had chosen. Some proof that the path Rose had taken had extracted something visible, some evidence that the difficulty was real and that the sacrifice had consequences that showed. Rose admitted the loneliness, said there were nights in the empty house when she woke at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark and thought about what she had traded for what she had, and whether the trade had been correct, and whether correct was even the right word for a decision that had shaped everything else for 20 years. They did not fix everything that afternoon. The friendship that had been cooling since 1963 could not be fully restored in a single conversation at a kitchen table in October, but something shifted back toward where it had started, something foundational and real. And when Vera left, she finished her coffee before she went, and Rose watched the Chevrolet down the gravel road and felt something unclenched in her chest that she had not fully known was clenched. It was 1996 when Vera came back with a different kind of request. She was sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon in April when she said she needed to ask Rose something, and the way she said it told Rose that the question had been prepared for some time. She said it was about Leland, her youngest. He had graduated from Kansas State the previous spring with a degree in agriculture. She said he wanted to farm. Said he wanted to farm in Russell County on the same ground his grandfather had farmed in the same tradition that the county had been built on. She said he had asked whether Rose would teach him. The request sat in the room between them for a moment. Rose asked what Vera had told him. Vera said she had told him to ask Rose himself. Leland Colton showed up the next morning at 7 o'clock on a Sunday, which told Rose something. He drove a truck that was older than he was, which told her something else. He was 22 years old, tall, with the particular combination of confidence and uncertainty that belongs to young people who want something they understand the value of and are not yet sure they have what it takes to get it. He told her that every professor he had talked to at Kansas State had said the same thing. Go big, leverage up, expand fast, use the tools available to you. He said he had grown up watching the farmers in Russell County who had done exactly that lose everything in the 1980s. He said he wanted to learn from someone who had not. Rose looked at him for a moment. She asked if he could start the following morning at 5 o'clock. He said yes, ma'am, without hesitation. The apprenticeship ran for 3 years. Rose showed him both journals in the first week. Her father's original, the one she had pulled from the stuck drawer in the winter of 1963, worn soft now from 33 years of handling, and her own, the one she had been keeping since 1964, which by 1996 was actually 3 separate volumes containing 32 years of field observations, soil samples, yield data, input costs, and the kind of operational notes that can only be written by someone who has been paying close and continuous attention to the same ground across many seasons. She watched him read. She watched him try to locate the information in the categories he had been taught to use, which were the categories of an academic discipline organized by principle and hypothesis and controlled variable. The journals did not work that way. They worked the way her father's mind had worked and the way she had learned to work, organized by observation and season and the particular character of individual sections of ground that had their own tendencies and their own histories. He was skeptical about the cover crops. He said it directly, which she respected. He said the research suggested that with modern fertilizer inputs you could achieve the same soil nitrogen levels more efficiently without the expense and lost production time of a cover crop rotation. She did not argue. She told him to try it his way on the 40-acre north section and her way on the comparable section to the south. She told him to compare them at the end of 3 years and decide based on what he saw. He did it exactly as she described. He managed both sections with care, kept detailed records. The way she had taught him, applied the inputs correctly, did not cut corners. At the end of 3 years, the data was clear. Not dramatic, not the kind of difference that announces itself, but clear and consistent and traceable, the kind of result that you trust precisely because it was not sensational, because it had accumulated slowly across many measurements and pointed in the same direction every time. His section was fine, her section was better. Better soil moisture retention in the dry year of 1998. Better organic matter by a measurable percentage. Better root depth. Lower input costs per bushel of yield, better in every category that mattered across a long enough time horizon. Leland closed his notebook after the third-year comparison and sat for a long time in the truck at the edge of the south section without speaking. Then he said that he understood now, not what she had told him, what he had seen. He said those were different things, and that he appreciated that she had let him find out which was which. Rose said that was how her father had taught her, and that she had not improved on the method. In the fall of 2005, a team from the Kansas State University Agricultural Extension Program came to the farm as part of a long-term study on sustainable soil management practices in the High Plains. There were 4 of them graduate students and a faculty lead, a soil scientist named Dr. Warren Goss, who had been studying the relationship between generational farming practices and long-term soil health for most of his academic career. They spent 3 days taking core samples from every section of the farm, running infiltration tests, measuring organic matter, assessing root zone depth, comparing what they found against the county baseline data they had collected from 20 other operations of similar scale. Dr. Goss went over the results with Rose at the kitchen table on the third evening. He laid the data out in columns with the professional care of a man who trusts numbers to speak for themselves when given sufficient space to do so. Topsoil depth on Rose's land averaged 12 inches across the farm. The county average was 7. Organic matter content was 5.8%. County average was 2.1. Water infiltration rate was 40% higher than the county baseline. Input cost per bushel of yield was lower across every crop she had grown in the previous decade. He asked her what she had done differently. She said she had listened. He waited for more. She pulled the journals out, both of them, her father's and the 3 volumes of her own, and set them on the table. She told him about Earl Callaway and the 23 years of field notes in the stuck drawer and the cover crop trials in the 1940s that had produced results she had only been able to confirm 30 years later with equipment that could measure what he had observed with his hands and eyes. Dr. Goss spent 2 hours with the journals, moving carefully through them, the way a man moves through something he recognizes as valuable and does not want to damage. He asked if he could photograph pages and use the data in a paper he was preparing on multi-generational soil building practices in the Central Great Plains. Rose said yes. She had one condition. She told him that when he wrote it up, she wanted the timeline to be clear, that this had not happened in a year or 5 years or 10, that it had taken 6 decades of continuous, careful work by 2 people on the same ground, and that there was no shortcut through it, no input you could purchase and apply to achieve the same result in less time. She said you could not buy this in a bag, and you could not borrow it from a bank. You had to build it 1 season at a time, and the building was the point, not just the outcome. Dr. Goss wrote that down in his notes exactly as she said it. In the spring of 2008, Rose Callaway turned 65 years old. She had been farming for 45 years. She owned 840 acres of Russell County farmland, every acre paid for, no debt attached to any of it. The soil in better condition than it had been when her father farmed it. which had been his specific intention and which she had understood and honored and extended beyond what he had planned for, because she had been given time he did not have. She was tired in the way that 45 years of physical work produces a tiredness that is structural rather than temporary, a tiredness that sleep addresses but does not cure, that lives in the joints and the deep muscles and the particular kind of bone weariness that comes from having carried something heavy for a very long time. She called Leland Colton in February and asked him to come for coffee. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, 34 years old now, with 12 years of farming behind him, 8 of them on leased ground in the county that he had managed with the patience and precision she had taught him. He had a wife named Clara and a daughter not yet 2 years old, whom they had named Rose without asking permission first, which Rose had not minded. She told him she was going to step back from daily operations. She told him she wanted to lease him the 840 acres on terms she had already worked out, terms that were below market rate and that included a structured path to ownership over 20 years if he chose to exercise it. She set the contract on the table. It was not written on a cocktail napkin or a torn piece of notebook paper. It was a proper legal document prepared by a proper attorney that said exactly what she meant it to say, in language that could not be made vague by a man with a fast-talking lawyer from Hayes. She had learned that lesson 40 years ago and had not needed to learn it twice. Leland read the contract carefully and completely, the way she had taught him to read everything without rushing, without assuming he understood before he reached the end. When he finished, he set it down and looked at it for a moment. He said it was more than fair. She said the land was worth taking care of, and that she wanted it in the hands of someone who understood that. She picked up Earl's journal from the end of the table, the original, the leather cover worn dark and soft from 67 years of handling, and she placed it in front of him. She told him it was not hers to keep anymore, said it belonged to whoever was going to do the work next, and that was him. Said the journal was not a document, it was a conversation that had been going on since 1940, and that she expected him to keep going. Said the last pages were blank, and that he should fill them. Leland picked up the journal with both hands. He said it felt like receiving something he did not fully deserve yet. She told him that was the correct way to receive it, and that the feeling would either pass or it would not, and that either way the work had to happen regardless. 2 months later, on a clear morning in May, when the light had that particular quality that Kansas light gets in late spring, when everything is green and the air is dry and the distance looks infinite in every direction, Rose sat at the kitchen table of the small house on Elm Street in Russell that she had rented for the last week of April and would now call home. She had brought 3 things from the farmhouse: the ledger, the 2 supplementary journals she had written herself, the 3 volumes that covered 1964 through 2007, and a new notebook empty purchased at the hardware store on Main Street for $1.35. She opened the new notebook to the first page. She picked up a pen. She wrote in the careful, precise handwriting that had started as imitation of her father's and had over the decades become its own thing, recognizable as descended from his but distinct, the way a second generation is always distinct from the first. She wrote, "For whoever comes next." She wrote, "This land does not belong to you. You belong to it. Take care of it, and it will take care of you longer than you will take care of it." She wrote, "My father left me a journal. I am leaving you 4. Read them all. Then write your own. The question is not whether you feel ready. The land does not ask that question. It only asks what you are going to do next. The answer to that question, written slowly across many seasons, is the only answer that has ever mattered on this ground or any other. She wrote Earl Calloway began this in 1940. Rose Calloway continued it in 1964. If you are reading this, you are the next person in that line. Do not take that lightly. Do not take it heavily either. Just do the work. The work will tell you what it needs. If you listen carefully enough and long enough, the ground will tell you everything. She set the pen down and closed the notebook. Outside the window, Elm Street was quiet in the early morning. The trees along the sidewalk in their first full leaf, the light coming low and clean from the east. 8 miles away, Leland Colton was already in the field, she knew. She knew because she knew what time he started and what his first field priority for May was, and how he would have planned the week. She had taught him how to plan the week. 8 miles away on the ground that Earl Calloway had begun building in 1940, the work was continuing. She thought about her father at the kitchen sink, the way he had stood in the evenings looking out toward the west field with the quiet of a man who has done what he set out to do for that day and is simply present in the fact of it, not triumphant, not relieved, just there in his own life fully. She had spent 45 years trying to become the kind of farmer he had been, and in the trying she had become something else herself, which was what he had intended all along. The journal had not been a set of instructions. It had been an invitation. Come look at what I saw. See if you see it too. See what you see that I did not. She had seen things he had not seen. The Merle Hutchins lesson. The Carl Braddock conversation. The morning she had sat in a truck across the street from Frank Denton's dealership with her hand on the door handle and her father's wedding ring tucked under her shirt. She had written all of it down. Not because it was heroic, because most of it was not heroic in any clean sense, but because it was true, and truth written down becomes usable by the person who comes after you, if they are willing to read it honestly. In December of 2001, Frank Denton had died. Heart attack quick at the age of 83. Rose had gone to the funeral and sat in the back row in the same dress she had worn to her father's funeral 38 years before. The pastor spoke about hard work and the businesses that had built Russell County into what it was. Afterward, in the parking lot, a man in his late 40s had approached her. He had his father's build and something of his manner, the directness, though on him it was softer. He said his name was Neil Denton and that his father had talked about her. Said especially toward the end in the last few years his father had talked about her often. Rose waited. Neil Denton said his father had wanted him to pass something along if he ever had the chance. Said his father had told him that he had been wrong about her. Wrong about the tractors, wrong about the land, wrong about what kind of person could do what kind of work. Said he had told Neil that he had spent 20 years being loudly publicly wrong about someone, and that there was a particular kind of accountability in that, which he had needed to find a way to meet before he ran out of time to meet it. Rose stood in the December cold and looked at Neil Denton and thought about his father on that October evening in 1986, sitting in a Ford truck in her yard with his hands on the steering wheel, working his way toward something true. She told Neil to tell his father she heard it, even if his father was not there to know she did. Neil nodded the way people nod when they have delivered something that was difficult to carry and are relieved to have set it down. He walked back to his car. Rose stood for another moment in the parking lot and then drove home. She had not felt vindicated. She had felt in a way she could not fully articulate that something had been completed the way a sentence is completed when the last word arrives and the meaning that had been accumulating finally has a place to rest. Her father had taught her that the land did not ask if you were ready. He had taught her by example and by the 23 years of field notes in the stuck drawer, and by the single line he had written on the last page of his journal in a hand that was already less steady than it had once been. Trust the soil. It will not let you down. She had trusted it for 45 years. She had been 20 years old with two broken tractors and $100 and a dealership owner's laughter still in her ears, and she had gone home and started over. And then she had done it again the next year and the year after that and every year that followed without exception. Not because she was certain, but because the work asked to be done and she was there to do it. The soil had not let her down. It had asked everything of her. It had taken the best years of her physical strength and a significant portion of her social life, and the kind of partnership that Vera had found, and Rose had not made room for, not because she was incapable of it, but because the farm had occupied the space that partnership requires, and she had chosen the farm and had not spent the intervening years pretending she had not chosen it. It had asked all of that, and it had given back more than she had put in, which is the only real promise that working ground makes to the person willing to keep the faith with it long enough to collect. The light was full now on Elm Street. The day was establishing itself ordinary and specific a May morning in Russell County, Kansas in the year 2008. Somewhere across town Carl Braddock was opening the bank. Somewhere on 2nd Street the pharmacy was unlocking its front door. 8 miles west on the ground that her father had started building 68 years ago, and that she had continued building for 45 years, and that Leland Colton was now continuing forward into a future she would not entirely see. The first tractor of the morning was moving down a field row in the particular steady way that comes from a machine that has been properly maintained and is being properly used by someone who knows what they are doing. She picked up the new notebook and set it with the others to be taken out to the farm when Leland was ready for them. 4 notebooks now, Earl's and her 3. A conversation across nearly 7 decades about the same ground about what it needed and what it gave back and what it asked of the people who committed themselves to it. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and drank it while the morning came in fully around her warm and clear and ordinary. The kind of morning that does not announce itself as significant, but that you remember anyway for reasons you could not always name precisely, but that had something to do with being present in your own life, at a moment when the shape of everything you had built was visible all at once. The land does not ask if you are ready. It only asks what you are going to do next.